The Victorian house stood at the edge of town, a relic of another era. Its faded grandeur hinted at a time when it had been one of the most prestigious homes in the area. The facade was adorned with intricate woodwork, and the tall, arched windows were framed by ivy that had been allowed to grow wild over the years. A pair of stone lions flanked the wide front steps, their features worn smooth by time. Despite the house's imposing exterior, I couldn't help but feel a sense of nostalgia and excitement as I approached. This house, this grand old home, was now mine, a legacy left to me by my grandfather. As a child, I had spent countless summers exploring its dusty rooms and hidden corners, always feeling a mix of awe and trepidation. The house seemed almost alive back then, its dark hallways and echoing chambers filled with the whisper of long-forgotten secrets. Now, as an adult, I felt a strange combination of excitement and unease as I moved in, the memories of those childhood visits flooding back with each creak of the floorboards. The first few nights were uneventful, a blur of unpacking and settling in. The house was full of quirks, creaky floorboards, drafty windows, and the kind of shadows that seemed to move on their own. The rooms were large and airy, with high ceilings and elegant moldings. The dining room still held the massive oak table where my family had gathered for meals, and the library's shelves were lined with books that smelled of dust and age. I spent my days cleaning and organizing, uncovering treasures and trinkets that my grandfather had collected over the years. A brass telescope in the study, an ornate grandfather clock in the hallway, and a collection of old maps in the attic all spoke of a man with a keen interest in history and the world beyond. Each discovery made me feel closer to him, as if he were guiding me through the house one item at a time. At night, the house took on a different character. The shadows grew deeper, and the air seemed to grow colder. I often found myself listening to the silence, waiting for the familiar creaks and groans of the old house. One evening, as I sat in the library reading one of my grandfather's old journals, I heard it. A faint scratching sound, like a mouse gnawing at the woodwork. I paused, listening intently, but the noise stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Figuring it was just part of the house's character, I dismissed it and went back to my reading. But the next night, the noise grew louder. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding as the scratching seemed to move from one wall to another, always just out of reach. I told myself it was nothing, just the sounds of an old house settling into the night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The following morning, over coffee, I mentioned it to my friend Jack, who had come to help me with the move. "Do you hear that?" I asked, hoping for some reassurance. "Hear what?" Jack replied, looking up from his mug. "The scratching, in the walls." He tilted his head, listening for a moment, then shrugged. "Old houses make noises, Mike. It's probably just the wood settling." His words were meant to be comforting, but they didn't ease my growing unease. I decided to investigate further. I walked around the house, pressing my ear against various walls, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. Every time I thought I had it, the scratching would stop, leaving me standing in the dim light, feeling foolish. One evening, as I was about to retire for the night, I heard the noise again. This time it was more insistent, almost as if it were trying to communicate with me. I followed the sound to a narrow hallway on the second floor, where the wallpaper was peeling and the floorboards were particularly creaky. The scratching was louder here, almost frantic. I placed my hand against the wall, feeling a chill run through me. The wall felt colder than the rest of the house, and the scratching was more pronounced. I knocked lightly and the scratching stopped. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing, then turned and headed back to my bedroom, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The next few nights were much the same, the scratching growing louder and more persistent. It seemed to follow me from room to room, always just out of reach. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the house settling, but the noise gnawed at my nerves, making it impossible to sleep. I began to dread the coming of night, knowing that the sounds would return, haunting the quiet darkness of the old house. Finally, one particularly restless night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and followed the sound to the basement. The basement was dark and musty, filled with old furniture and dusty boxes. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and the faint light from the bare bulb overhead did little to dispel the shadows. The noise was coming from a wall near the far end, a part of the basement that had always felt colder and more neglected. The air grew colder as I approached, the scratching growing louder, more frantic. I found an old rusty hammer among my grandfather's tools and began tapping the wall lightly, listening for a response. The sound grew louder, almost desperate. My heart raced as I pried at the loose boards, finally managing to pull one free. Behind it, there was a small, dark crawl space. I shone my flashlight into the void, my breath catching in my throat. There were markings on the walls, strange symbols I didn't recognize, and bones, so many bones. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The bones were small, animal-like, but there was something disturbingly human about them as well. The symbols, drawn in some sort of dark, dried substance, seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. As I backed away from the opening, I felt a cold presence behind me. Turning slowly, I saw Jack standing at the top of the stairs, his face pale and eyes wide. "What are you doing down here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I heard something," I stammered. "I think I found something terrible." Jack descended the stairs, his eyes fixed on the crawl space. He knelt beside me, his hand trembling as he touched one of the bones. The air around us grew even colder, and I could see our breaths fogging in the dim light. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely audible. "But it's been making those noises." Then the whispers started, soft at first like the wind rustling through leaves, but growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from all around us, echoing off the walls. We both backed away from the crawl space, our hearts pounding in unison. "We need to leave," Jack said, his voice trembling. As we turned to go, the basement door creaked shut with a deafening thud, plunging us into darkness. The whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, each one more desperate than the last. The flashlight flickered and then went out, leaving us in pitch black. "Mike," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible above the noise. "We have to get out of here." I fumbled in the dark, reaching for his hand. We moved slowly, feeling our way along the walls, the voices growing louder, more frenzied. As we reached the stairs, I felt something cold brush against my leg, and I stumbled, nearly falling. "Go, go," I urged, pushing Jack ahead of me. We burst through the basement door, slamming it shut behind us. The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. We stood there, panting, staring at the door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. The next day, we decided to research the house's history. We visited the local library and dug through old records and newspaper archives, hoping to find some explanation for the bones and the noises. The librarian, a kindly old woman with a deep knowledge of the town's history, was eager to help. She led us to a section of the library filled with dusty volumes and old newspapers, where we began our search. What we discovered was a chilling tale of tragedy and mystery. In the late 1800s, the house had belonged to a wealthy family, the Vandervelde. They were well respected in the community, known for their philanthropy and social gatherings. But one night, the entire family vanished without a trace. Their disappearance remained unsolved, and the house changed hands several times over the years. Each new owner reporting strange occurrences and unsettling experiences. The symbols we found in the basement were traced back to an obscure cult that was active in the area around the time of the Vandervelde's disappearance. The cult was rumored to have conducted dark rituals, seeking to commune with spirits and gain forbidden knowledge. The bones in the basement were likely the remains of those who had been sacrificed in these rituals. "Do you think the Vandervelde were involved with the cult?" Jack asked, his face pale as he flipped through an old newspaper article. "It's possible," I replied, my mind racing. "Or maybe they were victims of it." Either way, something terrible happened in that house. Armed with this knowledge, we returned to the house, determined to confront whatever was haunting it. We brought sage, holy water, and other items recommended by the librarian, who happened to be knowledgeable about such matters. As we prepared to cleanse the house, the air grew thick with tension, and the temperature dropped noticeably. That night, the noises returned with a vengeance. The scratching, the whispers, and now a new sound. Footsteps. It felt like the entire house was alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy. We moved from room to room, burning sage and reciting prayers, hoping to drive out whatever spirits were trapped within the walls. In the midst of our efforts, we heard a loud crash from the basement. Jack and I exchanged a glance, fear evident in our eyes. We hesitated for a moment, then made our way downstairs, gripping our flashlights tightly. The basement was colder than ever, the air almost painful to breathe. The symbols on the wall seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. As we approached the crawl space, the noises intensified, becoming almost deafening. Suddenly, the wall we had pried open earlier began to tremble, as if something on the other side was trying to break through. In a moment of reckless bravery, Jack grabbed the hammer and swung it at the wall, widening the opening. A blast of icy wind hit us, and the whispers turned into a shriek. From the darkness emerged a figure, cloaked in shadows and exuding an aura of pure terror. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and it moved with an unnatural grace. "We need to finish the ritual," I shouted over the noise, holding up the holy water. Jack nodded, his face set with determination. We began chanting the prayers we had learned, splashing the holy water towards the figure. It recoiled, hissing and writhing as if in pain. But it didn't retreat. Instead, it seemed to grow stronger, feeding off our fear. Suddenly, I remembered something the librarian had said. The spirits were bound to the house by the symbols. Destroying them might break the connection. I grabbed the hammer and began smashing the symbols on the walls one by one. Jack followed suit, and together we worked frantically, ignoring the figure's furious shrieks and the shaking of the walls around us. With each symbol we destroyed, the figure grew weaker, its form becoming less distinct. Finally, we reached the last symbol. As I raised the hammer to strike, the figure let out a final ear-splitting scream and lunged at me. I brought the hammer down with all my strength, shattering the symbol. The figure dissolved into a cloud of darkness, and the house fell silent. The air grew warmer, and the oppressive feeling lifted. We stood there, panting and covered in sweat, hardly believing it was over. In the days that followed, we finished cleaning the basement and gave the bones a proper burial, hoping to bring some peace to the restless spirits. The noises ceased, and the house felt different, lighter, almost welcoming. I spent the next few weeks restoring the house, finally able to enjoy the legacy my grandfather had left me. Jack and I remained close, our bond strengthened by the harrowing experience. We often talked about that night, wondering what exactly we had encountered and if we had truly banished it for good. But one thing was certain: the house was no longer a place of fear and darkness. In the days that followed, we finished cleaning the basement and gave the bones a proper burial, hoping to bring some peace to the restless spirits. The noises ceased and the house felt different, lighter, almost welcoming. I spent the next few weeks restoring the house, finally able to enjoy the legacy my grandfather had left me. Jack and I remained close, our bond strengthened by the harrowing experience. We often talked about that night, wondering what exactly we had encountered and if we had truly banished it for good. But one thing was certain: the house was no longer a place of fear and darkness. With the immediate threat behind us, I began to focus on making the house a home. I repaired the broken windows and fixed the leaky roof, ensuring that the structure was sound. I enlisted the help of local craftsmen to restore the intricate woodwork and refurbish the antique furniture. The house began to come alive with a new energy, a blend of its storied past and a hopeful future. I dedicated a room to my grandfather's collections, creating a small museum of sorts. The brass telescope found a place of honor by the large bay window in the study, and the old maps were framed and hung on the walls. I often found myself spending hours in that room, feeling a connection to the man who had left me this remarkable legacy. Despite the restoration efforts, there were moments when I couldn't help but remember the terror of those nights. Sometimes when the wind howled outside or the house settled with an especially loud creak, I felt a shiver of unease. But those moments were fleeting, overshadowed by the warmth and comfort that now filled the home. Also, in the end, just don't forget, it wasn't just a puppy, so you better click that subscribe button